Unleashing a knight towards the center, white aims for flexible piece development and prepares for kingside castling. Clears the path for the bishop, but cedes central influence for now. Establishing central control, preparing for rapid development and potential pawn breaks. Developing the knight to its natural square aims to contest the center and prepare for castling, setting up a solid foundation. Solidifying the center, white immediately stakes a claim and prepares to develop pieces aggressively. Preparing a kingside fianchetto, aiming for a flexible setup and controlling the long diagonal. Developing this knight solidifies white's central influence and prepares for further pawn expansion, aiming to cramp black's flexible setup. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal here perfectly targets the center and prepares for castling, a natural progression in this opening. Seizing central space, white boldly stakes a claim, aiming to restrict black's development and prepare a kingside attack. Securing the king's safety is a top priority, paving the way for future piece development and potential counterplay in the center. Securing the king's safety and preparing to develop the queenside piece forms a solid foundation for white's middle game aspirations. Developing the knight here fortifies the center and prepares for further queenside expansion, a logical step in this king's Indian setup. Casting kingside fortifies the monarch, a standard preparatory measure that also prepares for potential central pawn advances and opens the rook for action along the g-file. Challenging the center, e5 immediately ignites a battle for central squares and opens lines for your pieces. Anchoring the bishop here prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm, while also solidifying central control. Solidifying the center and preparing for d5, this pawn grab strengthens black's pawn chain without creating immediate weaknesses. Pushing the d-pawn dramatically alters the pawn structure, aiming to restrict black's queenside development and seize central space. Solidifying the pawn structure, but potentially surrendering central space and creating a queenside blockade. Shifting the knight to the rim opens a pathway for a kingside pawn push, potentially creating weaknesses around black's castled position. Rerouting the knight to the kingside opens up attacking possibilities and supports a potential f5 pawn push. Asserting central influence, the knight repositions, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing to contest the e-file. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside to break open lines for the beleaguered knights. Sacrificing the pawn opens the e-file for immediate piece activity and complicates black's queenside development. Opening the kingside file aggressively, this pawn capture initiates dynamic exchanges, potentially unbalancing the position. Unleashing the f-pawn aims to crack open the kingside, but it sacrifices pawn structure and risks overextension. Embracing the pawn chain's forward thrust, this pawn advances, seeking to disrupt white's central grip and open lines. Securing the knight's outpost on f2 allows for potential kingside aggression and reinforces the central pawn structure against black's advanced e4 pawn. Recentralizing the knight offers flexibility, potentially rerouting to a more dynamic square or bolstering the kingside defense. Shifting the king from the dangerous central files offers breathing room and a potential escape route should the kingside pawn structure crumble. Seeking to undermine white's central grip and generate counterplay on the queenside, black initiates a subtle pawn advance. Strategically widening the queenside flank, this pawn thrust aims to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure and gain valuable space. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure aims to prevent white's pawn majority from advancing aggressively. Positioning the queen centrally, it now eyes the kingside and supports potential pawn advances, reinforcing white's queenside pawn structure. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank immediately prepares for active participation on the flank, potentially supporting pawn advances or pressuring white's queenside. A defensive posture, reinforcing the king's shelter while potentially preparing a pawn advance on the kingside. A bold attempt to pry open the kingside, but it might expose your own monarch to undue danger. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, White seeks to disrupt black's kingside structure and create attacking chances. Seeking to establish a dark square control point on h8 for potential future kingside pressure. Opening that queenside flank could be a trap. It might invite pawn advances or create weaknesses around the king. Opening that b-file suddenly offers a potential avenue for counterplay, but it also exposes weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Fortifying the king and preparing a kingside advance, this rook maneuver subtly prepares for future pawn pushes or exchanges, aiming to leverage the open files. Reinforcing the rook's position on the 7th rank now becomes the priority, securing the pawn structure's integrity against potential white incursions. This knight's repositioning aims to bolster the queenside pawn structure and potentially launch a queenside attack later on. The rook now aims to dominate the open file and support further pawn advances. Initiating development of the queen's bishop, aiming to contest the crucial d5 outpost and activate the queenside. Reactivating the rook on the g-file seeks to contest the open line, a daring maneuver given the king's exposed pawn shield. Asserting pressure on the queenside with that bishop swoop opens up intriguing possibilities for piece activity. Challenging the pawn structure, this maneuver prepares to activate the queen and challenge white's queenside expansion. Asserting control over the file, this rook simultaneously eyes the queenside pawns and prepares to reinforce the kingside defense. Shifting the queen to the queenside initiates a potential attack on the vulnerable pawn. Shifting the rook to b3 aims to prepare a queenside invasion, leveraging the open file while potentially forcing concessions from black's defenders. Initiating a bold pawn push across the board now, aiming to unravel white's queenside structure and gain attacking momentum. This pawn thrust, while seemingly aggressive, exposes the white king and weakens the queenside pawn structure significantly. Consolidating the king's safety now becomes paramount, as the queenside pawn structure is severely compromised. Centralizing the knight after a maneuvering period, preparing to pressure the e4 pawn and challenge black's nascent central pawn chain. A surprising maneuver aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially liberate the rook from its passive post. Unleashing the knight to pressure the f7 pawn, seeking to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and create tactical opportunities. This retreat reestablishes the bishop's diagonal presence while preparing to defend the weakened kingside pawn structure. Anchoring the bishop here aims to solidify the queenside pawns against further encroachment, while indirectly supporting a potential advance of the g-pawn. Reuniting the rooks now aims to solidify the kingside, a welcome pause amidst white's aggressive advances. Shifting the knight to e3 aims to support an eventual kingside pawn push, while reinforcing the center's control. Challenging the knight's central influence, this move aims to disrupt white's positional buildup and open new avenues for black's forces. Sacrificing the bishop opens clear lines for white's attack, potentially exposing the black king. Exposing the king's defenses after the capture, this recapture opens critical lines for white's attack. Opening the d-file to target the exposed black king presents a direct challenge. Trading the bishop for a knight here clarifies the pawn structure, potentially opening a decisive path for white's rook on the open file. Securing the open files now, white aims to exploit the weakened kingside structure. Relocating the knight to g7 aims to solidify the kingside defenses, eyeing a potential retreat or support for the weakened pawns. Repositioning the rook to b1 prepares to exploit weaknesses along the b-file, anticipating potential pawn advances. Exchanging the powerful rook immediately simplifies the position, inviting a quicker endgame where initiative could be crucial. A crucial pawn exchange opens a vital path for your queen. The king abandons its sheltered, castled position, seeking a more active role in the unfolding battle. Reclaiming central squares, this gambit aims to expose black's exposed king and seize attacking chances. Seeking to untangle the tangled queenside pressure, this move repositions the queen for potential counterplay and defensive support. Capturing the pawn on b7 simplifies the position, leading towards a queenless middle game where white aims to exploit the open files. Recapturing the bishop solidifies the pawn's structure and opens diagonals for counterplay. Opening the queenside will create immediate pawn tension, forcing black's pieces to make difficult choices. Securing the bishop's escape route while preparing for potential piece exchanges. Repositioning the monarch aims to activate it for the ensuing endgame struggle. Transitioning the king into the action now is vital for activating its defensive and offensive potential as the position simplifies. Opening the b-file offers immediate pawn pressure, aiming to exploit the weakened queenside structure. Opening the c-file now presents an opportunity to activate the rook. The king now faces a dangerous discovered attack, inviting further complications. A desperate attempt to dislodge the powerful knight, sacrificing material for initiative in a collapsing position. Activating the knight to a central outpost, threatening a discovery and improving piece harmony. Repositioning the rook to support the king and prepare for potential pawn advances. The rook infiltrates the queenside, disrupting black's passive structure and seeking open lines. Focusing on liberating the king's bishop from its passive diagonal is crucial now. Asserting control over the 7th rank with this rook aims to disrupt black's vulnerable pawn structure. Abandoning the central control allows white to consolidate their advantage. Opening the kingside pawn shield exposes your monarch to immediate danger.